Hello and welcome to Heartlight Vedic Astrology. Today I was going to go through symbolism of the third house, or Bhava as it's called in Sanskrit, and this is from a Vedic astrology or Jyotish perspective. So just a note, if you're new to Vedic astrology or Jyotish or my videos, I create teaching videos on the subject, and all of the teaching videos you can find in my concepts playlist. Wherever you see a double asterisk in one of my talks, that means there's a teaching video on that topic. And there are a few videos that you might want to watch before this one, again, if you're new or if you're just trying to, increase your knowledge of Jyotish. They are North, South, and East Indian style charts, Introduction to Navigating a Birth Chart, Introduction to the Constellations or Rashis, Constellation or Rashi categories, the Lagna, also known as the Ascendant, Rising Sign, First House. Also for this talk, particularly, I would look at symbolism of Mercury or Buddha, because that's really important for the base energy of the third house. I do mention nakshatras or lunar mansions, and if you're looking for more content like this, specifically on the houses and bhavas, I'm growing a list of houses and bhavas videos, and they're in my houses bhavas playlist, so you can find them all there. So the second house, let's get into that. The second house in Vedic astrology, house we say Bhava if you want to use the Sanskrit. The second house is also known as Bratra Sthana, and Bratra means fraternity. So you can kind of, I don't know, one way to think about it is like the bro house. Maybe that's one way to remember that. Siblings is actually one of the indications for this chart, or this house. So if we look over here on the right, I have a North Indian style chart, and it's in the natural zodiac position, meaning that the first constellation, or Aries, also known as Mesha in Sanskrit, is in the first house. So you just want to make sure you don't confuse houses with zodiac signs or constellations. But in this case, they are actually the first constellation is in the first house. So if we're looking at the third house, though, in the natural zodiac, the third house in the natural zodiac is ruled by Gemini, and Gemini is ruled by the planet Mercury. So there's a lot of Gemini mercurial energy in the third house, related to the third house. And Gemini, if you're not familiar with it, is what we consider a dual air sign. So if those terms don't mean much to you, you might look at my constellation categories video. But there's a duality energy to Gemini, and so there is some duality related to the third house. Dual meaning that things can flip back and forth. People can be of two minds, especially since this is an air sign. And air signs generally indicate a lot of activity and play, especially in the mental realm or the ideal realm. Okay, rather than like a physical, rather than the physical tangible world or the emotional world, this is really all about thoughts and ideas. So the third house is also a Kamasthana. And so what that means, for example, if the Lagnatia or the ruling planet of the chart goes to the third house, the primary motivation is enjoyment. So other types of sthanas are like the Dharma sthana, so somebody who might be primarily motivated by duty, or the Moksha sthana, somebody who's primarily motivated by freedom. The Kamasthana, somebody, again, if they're Lagnatia especially, or if they have a lot of planets in a Kamasthana, the third house is only one of the Kamasthanas, but it is a Kamasthana. So if there are a lot of planets in the third house, then typically that person might really be interested in enjoyments, or be primarily motivated by that. Regarding health, the third house is related to the arms, hands, and shoulders. Yeah. So when I went through the second house, we talked about the second house representing from the neck up. So neck, face, mouth, nose, that sort of thing. So we're moving down through the body, generally speaking, as we move through the houses. So again, we're talking about arms, hands, shoulders in the third house. Also hearing and ears, specifically in the third house, the right ear, and partially the neck. The neck is kind of the junction point between, at least medically speaking or health speaking, or anatomically speaking, between the second house and the third house. And also because, again, we're talking, the base layer energy for the third house is Gemini and Mercury, a dual air sign. If there are negative placements here in the third house, you might find somebody who is often very confused, or the conscious mind. You can delve into the qualities of somebody's conscious mind by looking at the third house. Okay, whether that's working well, and somebody is very clear, or if somebody is very confused. The other thing about the third house is that it indicates things like courage. So, and the different sort of qualities that kind of integrate to give somebody courage to take action in the world. So prowess, perseverance, patience, like whether somebody needs to wait to find the right time to move forward, or somebody needs to keep moving forward step by step to eventually reach their goal. And this also includes things like power and stamina. So when there are a lot of positively placed planets in the third house, somebody can be quite courageous. Like one person's chart that comes to mind, they're a Scorpio Lugna, so they have Scorpio in the first house. And so if they have Scorpio in the first house, that means they have Capricorn in their third house, and they happen to have Mars in their ninth house. So when Mars is in their ninth house, it aspects into the third house, and Mars is exalted in Capricorn. So, and Mars is also the planet that represents courage. So that person has a lot of courage, and they happen to be NYPD, New York Police Department. So you would probably have to have a lot of courage to do that job, I imagine. So in any case, so the third house represents courage. Other things that the third house represents are communications, because again, Mercury is the planet of communication. And because Mercury is not only a planet that represents arms, hands, and shoulders, but this house represents arms, hands, and shoulders, that primarily the communications represented here, although it's a catch-all in many ways, we're talking about routine communications, written communication, because it uses the hands, even if you're typing, it uses the hands, or even sign language. Whereas oral communication is a little bit more kind of indicated by the second house, because again, the second house is so related to the mouth, okay, and qualities and actions of the mouth instead of the hands. Other things related to the third house is partition of property. So why might that be? Well, the fourth house represents property, and the 12th house to any house represents the loss of, or ending, or expenses of that item, that person, whatever is represented by the house. So when we're talking 12th to the 4th, partition of property, yeah, can be. Also, because of 12th to the 4th, the 4th house represents home. So if we're talking about kind of loss from home, this can indicate short travels, typically. Although the third house usually represents short travels, the ninth house usually represents long travels. But that can depend on what planets are involved in the third house. So if we have Saturn, which is a very slow planet, represents foreign things and long things and arduous things. If somebody has Saturn in the third house, they might tend towards longer bits of travel than somebody who's got maybe Mercury or Mars in the third house, because Mercury and Mars are not considered don't typically indicate endurance or length or that sort of thing. They're a little bit more finicky, a little bit more erratic. Also advice, possibly because we're talking about Mercury as part of this energy of the third house. Mercury, again, is about communication and thinking and rationality. So those things are, indicated here through advice. Also classic arts. So music, painting, especially classical music, classical painting, that sort of thing. can be well indicated here. But again, you have to consider the planets that are involved in the third house. So if you have a planet like Ketu in the third house, then all of a sudden you might have a classic arts, but with a spin, an unusual spin, or an exotic spin, or something like that. If I remember correctly, whose chart was it? Not Bob Dylan. Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix has a lot of planets in the third house, and I believe, if I remember correctly, he has like Mars and Ketu in the third house. And so, he was he actually he brought all this electrical guitar to his music, and he was also a lyricist, so he wrote music. So again, because of his placements in the third house, and if I remember correctly from his Dasha sequence of his life, so planetary sequence of his life, I think his third house was active from very early on, so he was kind of a child prodigy in music. Yeah, if I remember correctly, his rising sign was Sagittarius, so his third house was ruled by Aquarius. So Aquarius can be, again, a fixed idea or fixed air sign. So again, a person of many ideas, kind of far out, far-reaching, and he was very innovative in that regard. So what else? Apparel and earrings. I don't know exactly how to link apparel here to the third house. Earrings maybe because of ears. But we do have clothing and jewelry in the second house, but for potentially different reasons. The reason why clothing and jewelry is associated with the second house is because the second house is all about wealth. And so jewelry and clothing can be an indication, or at least a sign of wealth in certain cases. The third house is also related to education. Mercury is a planet that indicates education as well as students, but specifically within education, primary school, and also the trades. Because again, the trades, typically with any sort of trade, you're working with your hands. So education and working with your hands is indicated here. The third house can also represent religion, and this is because it's a reflection of the ninth house, which represents religion. And then this seems totally random to me, but maybe because it's random, it's easy to remember. Edible fruits and roots. So why that's here, I don't know. I'm trying to think about Mercury. Mercury does not necessarily represent underground fruits and roots. It actually represents long fruits and vegetables, so I'm not exactly sure, but there it is, edible fruits and roots. So if we're talking about people related to the third house, there are a few. The main one, obviously, because this is a Bratra Sthana, fraternity house, or a bro house, as I was sort of joking around. Siblings here. Especially younger siblings. Sometimes older siblings is taken to, the 11th house is related to that, or some Jyotishis will look at the 11th house for older siblings, but the third house classically is siblings. Also parents' death, so that's not exactly people, but something related to important people typically. The reason why is that the fourth house represents mother, and 12 to the fourth means loss or ending or separation from the fourth, so loss of the mother potentially. And the third house is the seventh house to the ninth house. And the seventh house to the ninth house represents father, and the seventh house is a Maraka Sthana, or a house related to death or endings for the father. Also, the third house can represent things like companions and friends. So, compadres, people who are kind of on the same kind of parallel level as you, not necessarily up or down. So not necessarily parents, grandparents, or children, but people who are, fraternal. Yeah, kind of, again, in parallel to you, or you're kind of parallel in terms of even your relationship dynamics. Also, neighbors and neighborhood is represented by the third house. Assistants and servants. So even though I mentioned, generally the third house is, we think about siblings, companions, friends, or neighbors who are all kind of on the same level. Assistants and servants can be associated with the third house. The reason being is that the third house is 6th to the 10th. The 10th house is related to career, and the 6th house of a zodiac or horoscope is related to servants. So you can pick up servants, especially related to like work, career, that sort of thing. The other thing is that servants, especially if we're talking kind of more old school lifestyles, when people had, and some people do still to this day, probably not as much as before, they would have servants living in the home. And so servants would sort of become an extension of the family. And so servants, let's see, family is related to the second house. So the second house to the second house, or the second to the second, is the family of family. So again, we kind of get an extended family type energy here, or again, we end up with servants. Yeah. So if the third house is really active, really important in somebody's chart, that can also, influence their career. And so when somebody has a very strong third house, we can see typically career-related things related to the third house are classic arts again, the trades, because again, the trades, you're coordinating the mind, even education in the hands. Also, people who have short journeys related to their profession, so maybe somebody who commutes a lot, or maybe a salesperson, because again, sales would be really indicated here, because Mercury represents business as well as potentially sales and marketing, because of the communication and networking aspect that Mercury can be related to. Also, careers related to courage. As I mentioned, that person who is a police officer has a very strong third house. And any sort of career related to communications, especially written communications, but also kind of an extension of that is computers and physics. Mercury, especially that planet, can represent computers, because again, the computer is very much an analytical, rational type tool, and Mercury is a very rational, analytical planet, or symbolizes that sort of thing. Communication is involved. All the coding and things like that is involved. Written communication, through computers is involved. And also physics. This is a little bit, for me, a little bit farther out, but, again, if we're thinking of Mercury, like just a very intense, pure Mercury, it's all about ideas, signs, and thinking through different scenarios and that sort of thing, almost like an Aquarius type energy, although Aquarius is ruled by Saturn. But somebody who's really, like Einstein, just always thinking about so many different things besides physics himself. And I believe in his chart, if I remember his chart, he has a lot of planets placed in the 9th house, which aspect and reflect into his 3rd house. So physics can also be important for somebody if they're 3rd house. Again, depending on what Rashi or constellation there is and what planets are involved there, but whose chart's coming to mind right now? I think Nikola Tesla. He's the person who's coming to mind. He has a lot of, I think he has 3 planets in the 3rd house. And I think his 3rd house is actually, I think he has a natural zodiac. So I think, if I remember correctly, he is a Aries rising. So he's a Mesha rising. So his 3rd house is actually going to be Gemini. And he had several planets in Ardra Nakshatra. And Ardra Nakshatra is symbolized by a storm cloud or electricity. And his whole life was about electricity. So there you go. There's an example there. All right, so that's the 2nd house. So I was actually in the middle of saving all of this and converting it into a video file, and then I realized there were a couple of things that I missed in the previous slide. So about the 3rd house, before I end things here. So the 3rd house is also known as a Dushtana and an Upachayastana. So a Dushtana is what we would consider a negative house. So it's associated with negative events in people's lives. It is a mild Dushtana, so it's not as virulent as what we typically see or find in the 6th, 8th, or the 12th house. So that's important to know about the 3rd house. It's also considered a Upachaya house, and what that means is that over time there would generally be improvements in that area of life. But again, that depends on the planetary period or dasha sequence somebody's running, and also the planets associated there. So if your third house is just decimated, then the improvement that may happen is that you find peace with whatever the situation is, not that the situation will necessarily get better, that sort of thing. All right. So in any case, I do want to thank you for your time. As always, I appreciate your support of my work and the channel. All of my teaching videos are in my concepts playlist. If you're interested in a personal birth chart reading, I do those on Zoom. You can write heartlightastro@yahoo.com for more information. I also have another YouTube channel on natural medicine where I talk about other Vedic arts such as Ayurveda and yoga, as well as other paradigms of medicine such as homeopathy and naturopathic medicine. And the name of that channel is Nature Source Care. So as always, I hope you found this interesting and useful as you navigate the energy cycles of your life. Until the next one, take care. Namaste.